May 8, 1945. 11:47 p.m. A rain-soaked street in Hamburg, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore of the 7th Armored Division stood in the ruins of what had once been a Wehrmacht command post, rain streaming off his steel helmet. Around him, his men celebrated. Church bells rang across the shattered city. The war in Europe was over. Behind him stretched an unbroken chain of victories. Ille-la-Main, Sicily, Normandy, the Rhine crossing. The British Army had helped crush the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. At that moment, standing among the wreckage of Hitler's thousand-year Reich, Whitmore believed his army was invincible, that the lessons learned in 6 years of total war had forged something permanent and unbreakable. What he didn't know was that in less than 5 years, the force he commanded would be gutted, transformed beyond recognition, and humiliated on battlefields he'd never heard of. The army that had conquered half of Europe was about to lose an empire. In May 1945, the British Army numbered 2.9 million men under arms. It fielded 25 divisions across 3 continents. Its tank formations had mastered combined arms warfare. Its infantry had learned brutal urban combat in Cannes and brutal mountain warfare in Italy. Its logistics network stretched from Burma to Berlin. The institutional knowledge was staggering. How to coordinate air support, how to break fortified positions, how to sustain armored thrusts across hundreds of miles, how to fight at night, in desert, in jungle, in snow. British officers commanded respect from Washington to Moscow. Montgomery's face was on magazine covers. Churchill's speeches had rallied the world. The mathematics of this dominance were undeniable. British factories had produced 27,896 aircraft in 1944 alone, 5,000 tanks, millions of shells. Training camps processed tens of thousands of men monthly. The logistical machinery could sustain armies on opposite sides of the planet, simultaneously. But beneath this apparent strength, a crisis was already met. Britain was bankrupt. The war had cost £7 billion in direct expenses and consumed a quarter-century's worth of national wealth. American Lend-Lease, which had kept the war machine running, ended the day Japan surrendered. By September 1945, His Majesty's Treasury calculated Britain had 6 weeks of dollar reserves remaining. The pound sterling, once the world's reserve currency, was propped up by American loans and prayer. Britain owed debts equal to 240% of its GDP. Every tank, every rifle, every pair of boots now represented not national power but national insolvency. In Whitehall, civil servants began running calculations that would have been treasonous to speak aloud during the war. How fast could you dismantle the fourth largest army on earth without triggering economic collapse or strategic disaster? The answer came in a series of Treasury directives that read like execution orders. In 1946 alone, the British Army was cut from 2.9 million to 1.1 million men. Entire divisions were disbanded on 30 days' notice. The 11th Armored Division, which had liberated concentration camps and accepted German surrenders, was dissolved. The 15th Scottish, the 43rd Wessex, the 53rd Welsh formations that had fought from D-Day to Veta simply ceased to exist. Regiments with 300 years of history were merged or scrapped. The mathematics were brutal. Britain needed to cut military spending from £1.6 billion annually to £600 million within 18 months. Equipment that had cost fortunes to develop was sold for scrap metal prices or simply abandoned. Thousands of Churchill and Cromwell tanks sat in depots, their guns pickled in grease, their engines already beginning to corrode. In Egypt and India, vast supply dumps were liquidated. Artillery pieces that had shattered German positions at El Alamein were sold to anyone with cash. The problem wasn't just numbers, it was knowledge hemorrhaging from the system. The sergeants who knew how to coordinate tank infantry attacks returned to civilian life. The officers who understood operational planning took jobs in industry. The maintenance crews, who could keep mechanized divisions moving, went back to being mechanics and factory workers. In 1944, British training establishments could process 40,000 recruits monthly through sophisticated programs covering everything from amphibious assault to anti-tank warfare. By 1947, that system was a skeleton. New recruits received 12 weeks of basic training where their predecessors had received 6 months. Advanced courses were cut or eliminated. Institutional memory was being deleted in real time. Meanwhile, the empire of these forces were meant to defend was beginning to fracture. In August 1947, India, the jewel in the crown, the source of millions of imperial troops, the strategic keystone of British power east of Suez, became independent. With it went an army of 2.5 million trained soldiers, built and paid for by Indian taxes. Overnight, Britain lost access to the Gurkhas, the Sikhs, the Punjabi regiments that had fought in every British war for a century. Palestine was descending into insurgency. Malaya was starting to burn. In Greece, British troops were fighting communist partisans with ammunition rationed to 10 rounds per man per day. But the real shock came in June 1950, on a peninsula most British officers couldn't find on a map. North Korean forces, spearheaded by Soviet-built T-34 tanks, crashed across the 38th parallel. The Americans, caught completely unprepared, screamed for help from their allies. Britain, desperate to maintain the special relationship and prove it was still a global power, committed ground forces. The 27th Infantry Brigade, 2 battalions of the Middlesex Regiment, and Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders shipped out in August. They arrived in Korea with equipment and doctrine from 1945, facing an enemy that had learned from the latest Soviet thinking. November 4, 1950. Dawn. The banks of the Chongchon River. North Korea. Temperature. -15 degrees Celsius. Major Henry Harding, of the Argylls, crouched in a frozen foxhole. Watching his breath crystallize in the air, his battalion was dug in along a ridgeline, part of a UN advance toward the Chinese border. Intelligence said Chinese forces might be in the area. Might be the word hung there, like the ice crystals. The Argylls were equipped exactly as they had been in 1944, Lee-Enfield rifles, Bren guns, Tunch mortars, a handful of 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Their winter clothing was inadequate. Their radios were outdated. Their supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to Pusan. Around them, American units had better equipment but suffered from the same delusion, that this war would be over by Christmas, that the Chinese wouldn't dare intervene, that modern firepower would shatter any human wave attack. Then the bugles started, not 1 or 2, but hundreds, echoing through the valleys. Then came the sound no British soldier had heard since 1945, massed infantry attack, not in the European style, but in waves that absorbed casualties and kept coming. Chinese forces' entire armies that had infiltrated south without detection, hit the UN lines with tactics perfected against the Japanese and nationalist Chinese. They attacked at night, in bitter cold, moving through terrain Western commanders considered impassable. They infiltrated between positions, cut supply routes, surrounded entire battalions. The Argylls fought with desperate professionalism, their rifle fire disciplined, their sections covering each other exactly as trained. But they were fighting a war their doctrine didn't understand, an enemy that accepted staggering casualties to achieve psychological and physical encirclement, that operated with minimal logistics, that turned Western firepower advantages into irrelevance by attacking at ranges where artillery couldn't respond in time. The 27th Brigade was mauled. The Argylls suffered over 200 casualties in a week. The Middlesex Regiment was nearly overrun. British units found themselves conducting desperate retrograde movements, retreats, covering American withdrawals. The humiliation was comprehensive. An army that had defeated the Wehrmacht was being outfought by peasant soldiers in quilted uniforms carrying bolt-action rifles. Not because the British soldier was inferior, but because the system behind him had been gutted. Supply chains broke down. Radio communications failed. Intelligence was non-existent. The battalions fought magnificently at the tactical level, and were defeated operationally because the broader structure no longer functioned. One Argyll sergeant, captured and later released, described it in his debriefing. They came at us like the sea. We'd kill 50, 100, and more would come. Our rifles were perfect. Our fire discipline was perfect. It didn't matter. We weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting a concept we didn't understand. The Korean War revealed the truth Her Majesty's government had been trying to hide. Britain could no longer sustain a global military presence. The 1951 Defense Review was another blow. Conscription was extended from 18 months to 2 years, not because Britain needed more trained soldiers, but because it needed bodies to maintain garrisons it couldn't afford to reinforce properly. The army that emerged was a strange hybrid, regulars and conscripts mixed together, under-equipped, scattered across dozens of colonial trouble spots, each one requiring a different type of war. The force wasn't designed to fight. Egypt, 1952, Malaya 1953, Kenya 1954, Cyprus 1956. Each insurgency required different tactics. Counterinsurgency, jungle warfare, urban policing. The British Army adapted, sometimes brilliantly. In Malaya, General Templar developed population-centric counterinsurgency that became doctrine for decades. British units learned to operate in small patrols, win hearts and minds, integrate intelligence and operations. But these successes were tactical, not strategic. They delayed defeat rather than securing victory. The empire was dissolving regardless of military success. Then came Suez, October 1956, the operation that proved Britain was no longer a great power, that the age of imperial intervention was finished, that London's decisions now required Washington's approval. British and French forces executed a textbook airborne and amphibious assault to seize the Suez Canal. Militarily, it succeeded. Politically, it was catastrophe. The Americans refused to support sterling, and the pound crashed. The Soviets threatened intervention. The UN condemned the operation. Within days, Britain withdrew, humiliated not by military defeat but by economic reality and diplomatic isolation. Sitting in a transport ship off port said, watching the Egyptian coast recede, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Carver Futurefield. Marshall wrote in his diary, We have proven we can still conduct operations. We have also proven those operations no longer matter. The currency that once bought empires now can't buy American acquiescence. The post-Suez era brought the final transformation. The 1957 Defense White Paper, written under the shadow of Britain's first successful hydrogen bomb test, formally ended the age of mass armies. Conscription would be phased out. The army would shrink to 165,000 regulars. Nuclear weapons would be Britain's guarantee of security, not massed divisions. The remaining ground forces would be professional, mobile, designed for rapid deployment to trouble spots, not sustained continental warfare. It was a rational response to economic reality. It was also an admission that Britain was now a middle power with pretensions, not a superpower with responsibilities. The regiments that survived did so through ruthless amalgamation. Ancient county regiments with battle honors stretching back to Marlborough were merged into new, larger formations. The Royal Scots Greys and the 3rd Carabineers became the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. The Somerset and Cornwall Light Infantry disappeared into the new Light Infantry Regiment. History was compressed, traditions blended, identities erased in the name of efficiency. What emerged by 1960 was unrecognizable to the men who had celebrated victory in 1945. The British Army numbered 258,000. Down from nearly 3 million, it had no heavy armored divisions capable of fighting Soviet tank armies. Its equipment was a generation behind the Americans and Soviets. Its global footprint was shrinking monthly as colonies became independent nations. Bases in India, Egypt, Palestine, Kenya, gone or going. The logistics network that had once sustained armies across 3 continents now struggled to maintain brigade-sized forces. Yet something survived. The professionalism, the regimental system that bound men to traditions larger than themselves. The ability to adapt, to learn, to improvise. British forces in Borneo in the 1960s conducted some of the most effective counterinsurgency operations in military history, with forces that would have been considered inadequate by 1945 standards. In Northern Ireland, British soldiers learned urban counter-terrorism through brutal trial and error, developing tactics that influenced armies worldwide. The Falklands War in 1982 demonstrated that even a hollow force could, under the right circumstances, conduct a successful opposed amphibious landing, 8,000 miles from home. But these were the achievements of a regional power, not an empire. The army that had helped destroy Nazi Germany now deployed task forces measured in battalions, not divisions. The industrial base that had built thousands of tanks now struggled to field hundreds. The training establishment that had processed tens of thousands monthly now graduated hundreds. In 1985, a retired general named John Hackett, who had commanded the 7th Armored Division's successor formation, gave a lecture at the Royal United Services Institute. His words were precise. The British Army of 1945 was a citizen force of extraordinary capability, forged in total war, sustained by a global empire's resources, and backed by an industrial base operating at maximum capacity. That army died between 1945 and 1960, not in battle but in treasury meetings. What replaced it was something more realistic, more sustainable, and vastly smaller. We did not lose our courage or our competence. We lost our economic foundation and our strategic necessity. Empires require armies. Post-imperial nations require forces. We made that transition poorly because we never admitted we were making it at all. The final truth was mathematical. In 1945, Britain commanded resources representing 10% of global economic output. By 1960, that had fallen below 5%. No amount of regimental tradition or tactical excellence could overcome that arithmetic. The British Army, after World War II, was not defeated on any battlefield. It was defeated by debt, by decolonization, by the simple fact that Britain could no longer afford to be what it had been. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, who stood in Hamburg believing in permanence, retired in 1962 with the rank of brigadier. He watched his division disbanded, his regiment merged, his certainties dissolved. In his final Staff College lecture, he said, "We won the war and lost the peace, not to an enemy, but to reality. The army you will command bears our name and our traditions. It is not the force I knew. Make peace with that, or you will spend your career mourning what cannot return." The thunder of victory had faded into the quiet accountancy of decline. From that moment on, the British Army belonged not to empire, but to history.